issues. Okay, that what problem they are facing in actually bedside treating those patients.
So I was given the job of talking about some highlights of the critical care management. So I will be just restricting on highlights only because every one of you are here are critical care people, and I don't need to talk about the basic critical care practices which is common in all ARDS patients or in all acute respiratory failure patients or all shock patients. You do day in and day out. So I will just talking about some salient points which are probably making us think a bit differently than when we started. Basically, with Professor Shah over here, Vibhuti Shah, I was also involved in writing the management protocol. Professor Ghosh is also there, who was also guiding me. So when we started, we were thinking a bit differently, and the COVID has done one thing. It has transformed all the medical teachers into students again, and we are learning every day. And so what I will be doing here, well, I will be just highlighting some points which probably will let you think also, so that we can come out of the consensus of what to do and how to proceed.
Sugato, you make it just click on full screen like PowerPoint. Okay. Very good.
So taking the tail from Professor Ghosh, I will be going into, I will not going into ventilation and all these things. I will be just going into some controversial areas probably, which still we don't know. Still we are learning every day. Just to start it, we all know that the clinical syndromes associated with COVID-19 are mild illness, pneumonia, severe pneumonia, ARDS, sepsis, and septic shock. And our cup of tea today here is those which are marked in yellow: severe pneumonia, ARDS, sepsis, and septic shock. And those are the people, those are the patients which critical care persons deal. So at the end of the session, I will be talking a bit about a new shift probably towards early invasive ventilation, or early or continuing a bit more with oxygen therapy and its devices like high flow nasal cannula, or sometimes a bit more of CPAP. Sir was telling that only 1 hour. So probably what we are thinking differently, why we are thinking differently, why the whole world is thinking differently, that we have to understand now. Why we are thinking of conscious proning, why we are thinking of a bit more delay in intubating patients. There are two reasons. Number one, whatever data has come out from the West, from China, from United States, from UK, from Italy, the outcome of invasive ventilation is not at all rosy. Recently, UK has come out with their national intensive care audit, and it has shown that the outcome of invasive ventilation mortality outcome is almost 60%. The outcome, the mortality in China, in many centers of China, is almost reaching 80%. In many US centers is also 70 to 80%. So why are we, what are we now, what to do with all these things? If these people, these countries with healthcare setups which are much more advanced, they have an invasive ventilation mortality rate of ranging more than 60 to 80%. Then what can we do in a hugely populous country? We are seeing every day that people are running short of ventilators. So they're now innovating many ways of ventilating 5 patients, 6 patients with one machine and all this stuff. So that's why, number one, the shortage of ventilators will be an issue if explosion happens in India in June or July. And number two, the mortality data of invasive ventilation is not at all rosy. That's why the whole world is probably being compelled to think a bit more, trying something before intubation, going straight away intubation. So oxygen therapy or invasive ventilation. Here also comes the importance of awake proning or conscious proning, which Amitabh was speaking about. Are checking recruitability or going for a good enough PEEP, because by now everybody knows the Gattinoni letter, the Gattinoni Blue Journal thing, that there are two phenotypes, probably different phenotypes. Yesterday, Shorenda was telling to talk about empiric antimicrobials, whether to give to everybody. And probably the most burning thing at this time, the place of anticoagulants, because the pathophysiology is being understood more clearly. The COVID hypercoagulability or COVID coagulopathy, and some specific therapeutic options. And I will not talk about COVID-19 and septic shock, because it's the same as the septic shock management which you do day in and day out. I will not talk about COVID-19 and renal replacement therapy, because all modalities of renal replacement therapy are indicated in AKI of COVID as the clinical scenario allows. And basic critical care practices is also the same, with only the infection control policies and infection control practices should be very, very strict, as stressed by Professor Vibhuti Shah. So is protocol-driven ventilation doing more harm than good in COVID acute respiratory failure? What we have done all these years, if a patient who has been failing with 6 liters of suppose non-rebreathing mask, we don't wait and straight away go for intubating the patients. So is this protocol-driven ventilation doing more harm? Here comes the Gattinoni's experience, and that comes from the Italian experience, that probably he has stressed about knowing about making an idea about the phenotype of the patients, phenotype of the acute respiratory failure. And he has written a very nice physiologically driven classification. Yes, it is not, he has written that it's a physiological conceptual model, but now the world knows about the L type and the H type acute respiratory failure in case of COVID. The L type is of low elastance, that is high compliant, high lungs, low VQ areas, low lung weight, because there are not so many areas of collapse, consolidation, and lung water, and low recruitability, because most of the areas of the lung are well aerated. So how are the CTs of these in these patients? These patients will present as just a peripheral ground glass with some intralobular lines giving a crazy craving pattern, some septal thickening, some interlobular thickening, some localized consolidations, and sometimes some traction bronchiectasis. So these patients have quite a normal area of a normally aerated lung, which is in contrast to the baby lung of a CT of an classical ARDS. So in the Italian experience, they have seen that probably 2/3 of the patients are of this type of severe pneumonia who have a quite compliant lung, and that's why going straight away into a positive pressure ventilation may do more harm rather in these group of patients. And there will be a group of silent hypoxia or happy hypoxia in this group also, who will not have too many symptoms because the lung weight is low, and the lung is not still full of water. So what is the proposed treatment model now? Type L, particularly those who are not dyspneic, yes, we should try with oxygen therapy. And if the patient is dyspneic, we shall not straight away go, we shall go straight away. We shall try high flow nasal cannula. We shall try CPAP a bit. Yes, there has been a recommendation of measuring esophageal pressure if you have a ventilator like that, but we have surrogates. Why they are talking about measuring esophageal pressure? Because they are trying to get an idea about the negative intrathoracic pressure swings, which causes lung strain, and those lung strain causes patient self-inflicted lung injury. And this L-type patients, if goes on breathing very heavily, not dyspneic, but high minute volumes, this will cause high negative intrathoracic pressure swings with high inspiratory esophageal pressure swings. Then these patients may go into an H type after 5 to 6 days. We are hearing reports that yes, the patient was sitting well, suddenly the patient crashed. So probably this is the scenario. We have to monitor these patients well, even we start with high flow nasal cannula and CPAP. But the take home point is that we should try probably to save ventilation, to save intubation a bit more. It does not mean that we will delay intubation, but we will keep a strict vigil on this patient while continuing high flow nasal cannula or CPAP, and do blood gases and clinical examinations very frequently and see that whether the patient is tolerating. To get an idea of the negative interthoracic pressure swings, we don't have a ventilator with esophageal pressure monitoring system. What we do here, we see the fluid column swings of the CVP, of the central venous catheter. If you see that the fluid columns are very hugely oscillating, then you understand probably, yes, this patient is having a huge negative interthoracic pressure swings. Then you be a bit careful that this patient may be intubated early. Obviously, not only that, that should be combined with other scenarios, the work of breathing, the visible work of breathing, the PCO2 level, whether the carbon dioxide is rising, whether the patient is being acidotic or not. But the take-home message here, we are probably trying to buy a bit more time than going to straight away intubation, which we were teaching or talking 2 months back or 1 month back. So this is the patient self-inflicted lung injury. Now this for intubated and deeply sedated L-type patients. These patients are highly compliant lungs, so there is no harm in giving an 8 to 9 ml per kg tidal volume in these patients, because the high compliance results in tolerable strain without a risk of VILI. Yes, as Professor Ghosh has rightly told, there is no point in playing with very high peak. These patients have normally compliant lungs. These patients have almost normal. There's nothing to open. The alveolus alveoli are almost open. So we should start with a low PEEP, given that recruitability is low. And if we give high PEEP in these patients, there will be unnecessary hemodynamic compromise. But there will be 20 to 30% cases of moderate to severe ARDS, and that is called the type H patients. And these patients, the moderate to the type H means a high elastance, a high lung weight, a high recruitability, and a high shunt fraction. These patients need to be identified. Yes, these patients has come to a moderate to severe ARDS. They will go for straight away invasive ventilation. And Professor Ghosh has told about the ARDS net, low tidal volume ventilation, PEEP titration, whatever. So oxygen therapy first, then checking, always monitoring the patient during oxygen therapy, high flow nasal cannula or CPAP. We use the ROX index while maintaining the patient on high flow nasal cannula. This is an SpO2 by FiO2 by respiratory rate to predict HFNC success, and a ROX index more than 4.88 at 2, 6, and 12 hours indicates a lower risk of intubation, and a ROX index of less than 2.85 at 2 hours, less than 3.47 at 6 hours, and less than 3.85 at 2 hours are predictors of high flow nasal cannula failure. The problem, and we can also try a CPAP also. The problem with this high flow nasal cannula in CPAP is this one: aerosol generation, and aerosol generation. So how all measures should be taken to minimize aerosol generation as much as possible. What can we do for a high flow nasal cannula? What we are doing, we are starting with around 220 to 30 liters flow instead of 60 liters flow. We are just putting a surgical mask over the high flow nasal cannula. We have framed a cut sheet, and we are covering the whole of the face with that cut sheet. Sometimes somebody is using a plastic cover also. And these are the ways we are trying to do it. And everybody around are in full PPE with N95s and other. If possible, a negative pressure ventilation airborne isolation room is indicated. But if if it is not possible to get such, a HEPA carbon photocatalysis room is also okay for that. For CPAP is also the same thing. So be very careful about airflow, airborne precautions during high flow or NIPPV. But we have to balance between this risk and the mortality risk of invasive ventilation. That's why we are taking this risk also of aerosol generation, taking all precautions from our side and from the patient side, just to prevent intubation, because the intubation data are not at all good. And please don't think that it is only COVID which is killing. Once the patient, we have to see the practical scenario. And maintaining an invasive ventilation means a huge tough crunch. In these patients, in this era where every healthcare person is being a bit tentative. So it's very difficult to follow the normal infection control practices which we do in an intubated patient. We cannot. So I wonder how many patients are dying from tube block and airway accidents because just nurses are probably a bit tentative. So these are the reasons probably everybody is trying to avoid intubation. But still, yes, early intubation is needed, but probably buying a bit more balance is probably shifting to a bit more trying with oxygen, high flow nasal cannula or CPAP. Conscious prodding, as Amitabh was telling, yes, all these, the oxygen therapy, high flow nasal cannula and non-invasive, can be combined with awake conscious proning. There is no outcome data still. The RCT has just started, but still in a pandemic, we don't have enough time for the RCT results to come out. So we have to invent, be innovative depending on physiology, pathophysiology, and our experiences. So the Intensive Care Society, so just yesterday, JAMA, May 15 JAMA, they published two small research letters, respiratory parameters in patients with COVID-19 after using NIV in the prone position in the wards. There was a second letter, use of prone positioning in spontaneously breathing oxygenated patients with COVID-19 with acute hypoxic respiratory failure. The results are mixed. The results, we have to admit, the results are mixed. There are some patients who could tolerate conscious proning. There are also patients who could not tolerate conscious proning and had to be made supine quite early and ultimately had to be intubated. But still, there are some ray of hope. Still, the RCTs come out, and as we are burdened by shortage of ventilators, shortage of staff, shortage of ICU beds, that's why we probably need to try all these things, including conscious proning, and see whether the patients are responding or not. So conscious proning with oxygen, conscious proning with high flow, conscious proning with NIV is probably should be tried if your infrastructure applies. And lastly, there was a nice by the eminent Laurent Brochard. He wrote the opinion about the small two studies. He also told that yes, data is probably lacking. We cannot probably totally say that conscious proning is very much helpful because RCT is the larger studies are needed. But if infrastructure allows, if expertise allows, it can be tried. But the patient should be monitored very, very carefully to see that the patient is not deteriorating while awake proning.
Dr.
So what are the benefits?
Dr. Sugato, time, make it a little short, because okay, don't mind.
So this is the ISC guidance regarding conscious proning. You can go into the Intensive Care Society guidance. It has come out. I am not going into the detailed guidance. These are the time position changes, as Amita probably somebody was asking. These are the clear guidelines: 30 minutes prone on bed flat, 30 minutes for 2 hours on right side, 30 minutes 2 hours sitting up 30 to 60 degrees, 30 minutes on left side, 30 minutes again prone, then continuing repeated cycle. Monitor SATs at 15 minutes and 20 intubate. Sarah's already told. How to intubate, nothing new. Checking PEEP responsiveness or any good enough PEEP. I use this term good enough PEEP. Yes, there are different types of diseases. There are different phenotypes. So you don't have a blanket high PEEP for moderate and severe areas. We have to check PEEP responsiveness or equitability in every patient. And whatever method of PEEP responsiveness, this is a simple method which has been written over here. Empiric antimicrobials, there is no point in giving empiric antimicrobials in documented COVID because bacterial superinfection is unusual. There is no routine so only an empiric antimicrobials can be given in not yet test positive SARI patients or positive patients where clinical suspicion of bacterial superinfection is high, and we should de-escalate or stop based on microbiology results. COVID coagulopathy, this is the thing. This is the Lancet article which came out last week. So now we were thinking that we were facing a DIC-like with microthrombi throughout the pulmonary vasculature and all over the body. So now probably the term is PIC, it is pulmonary intravascular or pulmonary immunovascular coagulopathy, which is more like a macrophage activation syndrome or a secondary HLH. So this is the differentiation between a DIC and the PIC. In case of PIC, the D dimer is markedly high, but all the other markers of DIC, like the fibrinogen, like the platelets, like the P time are normal, and this is the DIC. Yes, the COVID PIC in the late stages can transform into a DIC, but still, the first thing which happens in COVID is PIC, probably not DIC. Even if the transformation occurs, it is more of a compensated DIC than an acute DIC because again the D dimer is high, but the other parameters are normal. The patient is mainly thrombotic but not bleeding. When to give anticoagulants is the same thing, is the same to prophylactic dose anticoagulation for all inpatients, intermediate and therapeutic dose to selected ICU patients, but this needs to be individually decided, balancing the bleeding risk of the patient. Still, the guidelines have not yet come. The International Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasis has come out with the guideline, but still larger studies are needed regarding therapeutic anticoagulation dosing and in which subgroup of patients. in the treatment modality is the same, bleeding is same. Suggested risk stratification, which has been suggested by in our management protocol from the government, a D-dimer less than 1000 prophylactic dose, more than 2000 imaging. If imaging is not feasible, give therapeutic dose, D-dimer 1000 and 2000, an individual clinician's decision. COVID specific therapy, still now there is nothing, but these are the options. This is a nice graph. You see that this is in the first part of the response, the type 1 interferon response increases, but in case of mild disease. So here is the area where the antivirals, chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, these come into action. In case of mild severe disease, the lymphocyte count slowly increases, the disease severity decreases. But in severe disease, the viral load is high, but the disease severity increases with a huge cytokine storm. And here the antivirals have no role over here. And here comes the importance of biologics, steroids, or JAK inhibitors. Options, you all know, these are the options, but still now there is no study to point one. We are waiting for the Solidarity trial and the Discovery trial. The Solidarity trial from WHO, the Discovery trial, a French trial. Our government West Bengal protocol, everybody can go into the net and see it. Mild cases, nothing. Moderate, mild cases of comorbidity and moderate cases, only hydroxychloroquine, and severe cases, hydroxychloroquine, and steroids in progressive deterioration of oxygenation, rapid worsening of imaging, and excessive activation of body's inflammatory markers. Steroids at a dose not to exceed the equivalent of methpred 2 mg per kg per day for a very short period of time of 3 to 5 days. COVID-19 and shock, same as septic shock, nothing, no more. You do it every day. Renal replacement therapy, I have told there is nothing new in it. It is the same in renal replacement therapy in sepsis. Other critical management is also same. So I conclude with roughly 80% will be mild illness. You don't, as Arindam was told, we don't have to do anything. Just a tender, loving care, isolation, and watching Netflix is the treatment. 20% are severe, needing monitored care. Among these 20%, 5% will need invasive ventilation, among whom roughly half are surviving and giving a case fatality rate of 2.5 to 3% around the world. But we have to keep in mind that if we do not support this whole of 20% well, then more and more land will land up into invasive ventilation and the outcome will be worse. So our target is not that 5% of invasive ventilation. As intensivists, our target is that whole 20% of severe disease to get a case fatality rate of 2.5 to 3%. Thank you.
I first thank Dr. Dasgupta about his excellent lecture. He has covered everything very up to date, and I couldn't agree less in any of the points. I've got we are treating we have got a wing right now of about approximately 45 to 50 beds. We are keeping 5 beds for our own healthcare workers, so it's about effectively 45 beds, and mostly they are full, almost 100% full. We are treating that amount of patients. We have already treated more than 100. I think about 150 we have treated. Many have gone home, but our results among the ventilated patients are not good. Still, we have not saved ventilated patients who required mechanical ventilation. There are some patients we are not using HFNO. We are using BiPAP. Initially, we had some reservations about using BiPAP in the sense that they might be aerosol generating, but right now I think we have got enough data to show that it is not like that. So we are using BiPAP, and we we are using mechanical ventilation. I think about this one point which was discussed in the previous lecture, that whether we should go on giving the patient NIV or high oxygen, say non-breathing mask or HFNO, till to the point the patient is very bad and we go into ventilation, whether that will save us of what we want to save, that is save us from intense nursing. Because these patients who are being pushed into a sort of supra guidance level of oxygen only, not to put them on intubation ventilation, in spite of their being very hypoxic. So that will also require intense nursing. From that point of view, this may not be good. Again, whether mechanical ventilation itself is killing or the patients who are serious enough to be ventilated, they are dying, I do not know. It's difficult to say whether the ventilation is at fault or the patients who are requiring that amount of ventilation are at fault. We had a few deaths which already have been pointed out because I think every hospital is facing some logistic problems. that nurses going into those wards are still volunteers. Among all our nurses, we are asking for volunteers, and those nurses who volunteer to work there, they are brought into that department. We cannot force, or being a private hospital, I cannot force a nurse to go that will have to go and work. Some are flatly refused. So sometimes we have to do with nurses who are not basically experienced in ICU work. Not so experienced, I'd say. Not experienced, I'd not say. Not so experienced, junior nurses. So they had some point picking up alarms or calling the doctor at proper time. So we had 1 or 2 mishaps in that way. I feel on retrospect. The patients, sometimes they become very bad. Some of the patients that died because of worsening of ARDS. Some of the patients have died of the ARDS was getting better, almost on verge of extubation when they had that sudden shock, which people right now call the cytokine storm. There are all shocks of excess cytokine. I don't know whether it's a new physiology or not. Anyway, but that is what we call right now cytokine storm. Some of them have died of that. So that is that 1 or 2 we feel they died of ancillary conditions. They're very elderly people with multiple problems.